Hello and welcome to WNHH FM's Dateline New Haven. I gave you an extra H there. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to join me on an exploration of what makes the Elm City tick. Peter Goselin is looking to make New Haven and Connecticut tick as our next Attorney General. Peter is the Green Party's candidate for the post in this fall's election, and he's here in the WNHH studio to tell us all about it. Welcome, Peter. Nice to meet you, man.
Well, thanks. It's actually great meeting you, Paul. After all these years, we've intersected at various places over the years, I think.
I am sure we have. We found out before we were on the air they were the exact same age.
Yes.
With some similar history behind us.
Very much so. Well, longtime Connecticut residents involved in trying to, uncover the truth about things.
Although I have never run for Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, which is what you're currently engaged in, Peter. How's the campaign going?
Well, we're just getting started. We just set up our website just within the last couple of weeks. The campaign has a Facebook page. Folks can look for us online as Goselin 4AG, Goselin 4AG. We're starting to get some good response from people, but it's still early.
And have you ever run for office before?
No, I never have.
So what got you at 58 years old to take a plunge like this for a statewide campaign?
Well, really, in some respects, the idea was that I was looking at the situation of the Attorney General as from a lawyer's point of view and saying, there are so many issues that people desperately want to see the government take action on, and it's not happening. And it's not coming from the legislature. It's not coming from the AG's office. It's just not happening at all. And I wanted to communicate to people that there are actually things that we already have the power to do to address some really serious issues. What it takes isn't a new set of laws to be passed. What it takes is the political will to use the laws that we have. So
the Attorney General is often called the people's lawyer. You don't do criminal cases. That's the state's attorney in Connecticut. The Attorney General files civil lawsuits on environmental issues, financial fraud, and public health. Gotten, I think, tens of millions, if not more, a year come into our coffers because of suits that George Jepsen has filed, usually in conjunction with other attorneys general. You also have a second important function as Attorney General if you're elected, which is to advise the governor and the legislature when they ask for your legal opinion on matters they're involved in. So, Peter, you said you feel that there are enough laws on the books to do more for consumers, for civil rights cases, whatever, environmental cases. I'm not sure which ones you're focusing on. Which laws are you specifically thinking on, and what kind of action could the Attorney General take with them?
Well, as we were thinking about launching this campaign, the one thing that came through really clearly was that the number one issue that politicians aren't addressing in the state of Connecticut, not just in Connecticut, but all over, that is not being taken up by the major parties, is the problem of the escalation, really the epidemic of police violence and the militarization of police departments. And this is something that the Attorney General in Connecticut can take action on because, of course, in situations where a local police department is involved in racial profiling or is determined to have a culture of racial bias or to be engaged in training activities that promote the use of violence against people of color, that would be in violation of Connecticut's Constitution, which provides for equal protection for all citizens, for all residents of the state.
And you're right, because usually when those cases are pressed, it's the federal government. In East Haven, we had decades of police profiling, and then a bunch of years it was targeted specifically at Latino immigrants. And it did take a federal Justice Department investigation under Eric Holder to blow that up, send corrupt cops to jail, and get some real change there. Do you feel that, I guess, under Jeff Sessions, we're not going to be finding in that he's declared they're going to be going a different way?
Yeah, we're definitely not going to be.
There were federal consent decrees in cities like Chicago that he wants to undo, even when the police departments thought they were a good idea.
That's correct. There's no question that we're going to see any of that sort of activity under a Trump presidency or under a Republican presidency. Frankly, I doubt that we will see it in the future under a Democratic Party presidency, because I think what we're seeing is an increasing consensus between the parties on certain issues, that for all of the evident antagonism between Republicans and Democrats, there's a fair level of consensus at the federal level, that there's not going to be campaigns to reduce police violence or to address the problem of racism by local police departments. That's just not going to happen.
Don't you think that Obama did a lot of that? He did the consent decrees, I believe, in Baltimore and Milwaukee, was it? And Chicago and East Haven. And those were just some of them under Eric Holder. You don't think they were taking that issue on?
I think those were steps in the right direction. I think you could also give counterexamples during the Obama administration of increased collaboration between federal and state and local law enforcement agencies for example, to target Muslim Americans. Certainly the intelligence centers in New York and Long Island did an enormous amount of work, even in the state of Connecticut, even beyond their jurisdictional reach.
And were those federal agencies, were those, because I know in New York there was a whole unit in the New York Police Department that did that.
They have a unit in the New York Police Department, but it works in tandem with the FBI.
And where we see the Democrat, and you know the argument's always been left: do you go to try to make the Democratic Party more progressive, or do you work outside the party because they're too beholden to their establishment backers to ever change fundamentally? And I think the answer was often both. You had sort of DSOC and you had the Green Party. Do you feel the Democratic Party with the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing might be moving more in that direction?
I think that wing of the Democratic Party is going to is actually, if it hasn't already, is headed for a split. I think there's definitely folks who are going to remain committed to the idea that they can reform the party, especially folks who are activists in, like, for example, in Connecticut, smaller towns in Connecticut where they feel that they can have influence in their local Democratic town committees.
And that's what the Working Families Party has been promoting.
True, exactly. On the other hand, I do think that there's a significant element that came out of the elections and said, you know, it's really pretty clear that there's a limit to the kinds of change that the Democratic Party will embrace. And if anything, since the election, the Democratic Party national leadership seems to be indicating that the extent of that change is even narrower than we might have believed when Bernie Sanders was a candidate.
You know, what struck me was, you know, the Working Families Party basically has your agenda, I would argue, or the Green Party, but they try to reform the party from within. The Democratic Party, they endorse Democratic candidates, have a ballot line, and use that as leverage. In New York City, you had a candidate who was the avatar of what either the Working Families Party or Green Party would support, Ocasio-Cortez. The Working Families Party thought she had no chance, so they actually endorsed the incumbent, Joseph Crowley. And when she pulled off a historical victory, this is the amazing irony of it to me. Now Joseph Crowley's name is going to be on the ballot in November, preventing a true progressive Democrat insurgent from winning because he had the Working Families Party line, and they've been unable to convince him to abandon it.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty astonishing development, but it definitely demonstrates
says something. Yeah.
Yes, it does, exactly. That this is a really dangerous road that you go down when you decide that you know, that you're going to, as a supposed independent force, that you're going to, you know, pick the winners within the Democratic Party. And this is a classic example of the leadership trailing behind, you know, the grassroots. And I think, on the one hand, I think Ocasio-Cortez's victory is certainly very significant, and I think it's a promising sign. But I think it's also, what has happened since then is a pretty strong indication of the limits of change that we can actually expect to achieve within the Democratic Party.
And you're listening to Peter Goselin. We're speaking with him here on WNHH's Dateline New Haven. Peter is the candidate for Attorney General in Connecticut for the Green Party. Okay, so Peter, you talked about if you were elected, you would like to see Attorney General under the Constitution, Connecticut Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, sue local police departments for racial profiling.
Yes,
Do you have
exactly.
any departments in mind?
Well, you know, we've had some pretty unpleasant stories coming out of New Haven, but it's definitely not just New Haven. You know, we've had some very serious incidents, including injury in a high-speed chase, you know, a police shooting in Bridgeport, Waterbury. You know, these are all definitely candidates. But, you know, I also wouldn't want to suggest that this is strictly a problem of urban police departments. In some of our more suburban and rural communities, the problem may not be that there is a large population of people of color who are being targeted, but we still have really significant problems with these suburban police departments targeting people of color when they pass through those communities. In other words, the famous line, "Well, you look like you didn't belong here because you are a person of color." And it's one of those things. When you talk to folks who are people of color who living in Connecticut, there are so many who have told me so many stories, so many horror stories about dealing with police departments. And yet there are so many of us, so many white people, who have no familiarity with this problem at all. And I think one of the reasons to target this issue is to open up a dialogue and make people listen to what people of color have to say about their experiences with law enforcement, and not assume that we know the answer.
And what kind of remedies would you seek in court?
Well, ultimately, you talked about the example of East Haven, which I think is obviously one of the best examples that we have. If we're talking about a situation where there's really an ingrained culture of racial bias, it might be the case that we end up going to a judge and asking for a consent decree, or asking for the judge to issue an order that forces that department to reorganize. In the worst case scenario, we would want to see what happened in East Haven. We'd want to see a department being placed under the supervision of an independent third party appointed by the court, who then makes all the decisions about who will and will not be allowed to remain in the department, and what changes will take place in the training programs.
And of course, in East Haven, we had both civil and criminal remedies. The Justice Department criminally prosecuted Miller's Boys, a group of men who repeatedly falsified documents and covered up, just beating up and brutalizing and planting evidence on people. And then they also had the civil remedies you were just describing.
Right, exactly. And I think one of the things about a civil investigation through the Attorney General's office is that it may very well lead to the discovery of evidence of more criminal conduct.
So, you are right about the parties. When you made a call, you made a press release about two incidents I wrote about in New Haven, and you said you wanted the Attorney General to investigate it, and you called on other candidates to do the same. And I called other candidates, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. None of them would actually answer the question. They just said, we support civil rights. So they weren't willing to make that call. One of them was a June 6th arrest. There was a man loudly complaining on the green about police conduct and kind of a tense situation on the green, but he wasn't looking at the officer. He was, about maybe, a few steps away. An officer was dealing with an intoxicated person, and the officer then engaged him, saying, look, he didn't like being criticized, and in the end they wrestled him to the ground, hurt him, and arrested him. And then around the same time, and he was African American, and around the same time, an African American woman was wrongfully arrested. She was 70. She had the same name as a woman who was 50 who was wanted for a nonviolent misdemeanor, and they kept her in jail for a long time, and she was pretty upset about that. So you wrote, two events in 1 week involving New Haven police officers and African-American residents in the context of a national epidemic of police misconduct against people of color shows the need for action to enforce civil rights laws against the NHPD. So we wrote about your call in The Independent. Can I read you some people who took shots at you, including some cops, for a response?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Can I read you some of the comments?
Oh, please. Yeah, no,
I've
read some of them, but I don't believe I've read them all.
I'm not going to say them all, but one guy who I think is a cop, he says, I'm concerned about Mr. Goselin's ability to execute the office of Attorney General. If he sees racial bias where a white police officer is having a perfectly civil interaction with a black public drinking offender, while a black police officer arrests a different black offender for committing a crime, he calls the crime criticizing the person when he wasn't looking at him. But his point there was that it was a black officer who did that, while another white officer was having a good interaction with a black person he was about to arrest. And then Concord writes, looks like Goselin does not know the facts in this case. A black police officer arresting a black person for violating the law. Do your homework, Goselin, and report the facts as they are, 2 exclamation points. So what do you say, Peter Goselin, to Narcan and Concord?
Well, my response to that would be, first of all, when we're talking about a culture of racial bias and violence against people of color in police departments or in any institution for that matter, it's definitely a mistake to think that the only perpetrators will be white people. That when that culture permeates an organization, it's an invitation for people to understand that if you want to get along, if you want to be a part of this organization, if you want to function in this organization, you will participate in that culture. Now, the plain fact of the matter is, in this case, that no matter how we slice it, is that this was a reaction by a police officer to someone who was vocally criticizing how the police do their job. And frankly, that's just not a crime. In fact, not only is it not a crime, it's conduct that's expressly protected by the First Amendment. So for an agent of the state to target an individual because they are even claiming, even if they're mistaken, that there is racial bias going on in the actions of a police officer, for the state to act against that person, that's outrageous. And the fact that we have to process it and even think about how outrageous it is shows just how far down the road we've gotten, to the point where we're not allowed to question the police anymore.
And obviously there are issues intertwined. There are issues of race, and there are issues of the civil rights and civil liberties. The police department in New Haven had a long history, including against the Independent, of taking people's cameras when they were trying to take pictures of police doing their work, and sorry about lack of respect for that. But how do you decide when it's a racial versus a just civil liberties violation, or maybe they're intertwined so that it doesn't matter?
Well, I think it is often intertwined. I also think that it's important to talk about them in tandem, because, when we're talking about violations of civil liberties because of people criticizing the police force, the first targets are always the population that's being policed. Here in New Haven, some of the folks who have been vocal activists and have put out demands for a civilian police review board and for more accountability have also been individually targeted for reprisals, not just because of their race, although I think it's a factor, but also because of their public criticism. And I think one of the good reasons to have that discussion in a very public way is that it engages a much bigger part of the population. Those of us who say, of course you should have the right to criticize the government when it oversteps its bounds, as well as those who are the recipients of police violence because of their race. The issues really can't be unwound from each other. That's also why, in the context of discussing this as a campaign issue, it's also why I've discussed it as part of the overall issue of the militarization of the police.
And Obama was involved in that, selling surplus military gear to local police departments.
Specifically, yes, but in general, we've seen this tremendous change in the way that police departments operate, where military-style tactics and military-style gear are just part of the everyday part of,
And what kind are you talking about, like tanks? You're talking what kind of long rifles? What kind of military gear are you focused on?
I think that when we're talking about using, for example, in not here in New Haven, but in other communities in cities where, for example, they're using these new sonic weapons. Essentially they are anti-personnel devices. They are intended to cause anybody within range physical pain for remaining there. In other words, it doesn't make any difference whether you're committing a crime. It doesn't make any difference whether you've disobeyed a police order. The government is literally punishing you for being present at a place that they don't want you to be, even though it's a public place. And I think when we start talking about these kinds of tools, when we talk about the use of tasers as a way of punishing somebody, not because they're non-compliant, but because a police officer doesn't like what they have to say, or because they're not acting quickly enough. When we see these kinds of weapons being used in a really indiscriminate fashion, and being used in order to promote cooperation with the police, not because you've committed a crime, but just because the police want you to do whatever it is they want you to do, then I think we've really headed into some dangerous territory.
All right, we've headed into Attorney General campaign territory today on Dateline New Haven, WNHH FM, your home for community radio, 103.5 FM, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. Today we have with us the candidate for Attorney General in Connecticut from the Green Party, Peter Goselin, going after the open seat being vacated by retiring Attorney General George Jepsen. So you weren't a fan of Jepsen?
I think that Jepsen has done what attorney generals, Democratic Party attorney generals, have done over the years. In Connecticut, that office has been held by a Democrat since I think 1959. So it's been a position that's been sort of reserved for them. And when it comes to some of the issues involving consumer rights and tobacco litigation and things of that sort, some of our attorney generals have done a decent job within that realm, but they are definitely not using the full scope of their authority, and they're not using it in a fashion that's going to address really critical local issues.
How's now? You live in West Hartford, you said, right?
That's right.
And you practice law there as well?
Yeah, my office is in Hartford.
Okay, you said you focus on labor and employment issues mostly, right?
That's right. I represent individual employees and labor unions against employers.
What's the case you're proudest of that you've filed, Peter?
Let's see. I would say that it'd be hard to pick out one, but I can tell you that a class of cases that I have handled over the years, over the last decade or so, I've represented quite a few people, primarily undocumented immigrant workers, in claims against employers to recover wages that weren't paid. And that's definitely the work I'm the most proud of, because very, very often these are folks who have been really beaten down and intimidated to the point where they have been led to believe that they have no rights at all, and are often really terrified of the possibility of retaliation by employers. They finally decide that they want to act, and very often the employer's initial response is really to tell them, well, you have no rights. If you complain, I'm going to turn you over to ICE or the police, and you're going to get deported. And it's a real wake-up call for some of these employers when they find out that, no, as a matter of fact, we're going to take them into court. We're going to scrutinize. We're going to look at their books. We're going to look at their employment records, and we're going to punish them. We're going to get double and triple damages and attorney's fees if they won't pay these workers what they owe them.
Tell me about one of those cases.
Let's see. Okay, so an employer who is comes into the United States with a nanny that he and his wife have hired to take care of their children, and she is from his home country, which is Peru in this particular case. Although I've handled these kinds of cases with employees from a number of different countries. She enters the country lawfully. There is a written contract which is required by U.S. Immigration provisions, saying that she's going to be paid at least the minimum wage for every hour that she works, that she's going to be paid overtime if she works more than 40 hours. After they arrive in the United States, he takes away her passport. She works for him for a period of 6 or 7 years, and during that time, they pay her basically enough money so that she can buy clothes.
Wow.
They don't actually pay her wages. She has to go to them and say, I'd like to be able to go to the store and buy clothes.
She's enslaved.
Yeah, it's involuntary servitude. It's slavery. Of course, the interesting thing about it is that when we have confronted these employers, not just in those, but in some of the other cases that I've handled involving wage theft as well, the one thing you can count on is that the employer will respond and how shocked they are that the employee would complain, because after all, I treated them like family. And every time I hear that,
for what you do. So in this case, when was this? When did she come to you, and why did she come to you?
This was about This was about 5 or 6 years ago. She actually came to me through a clinic that was being operated by Connecticut Legal Services, which was a really great program. They referred her to me because of kind of the severity of the legal issues and the conditions that were involved. And we were able to recover a substantial amount of money in a settlement. I can't say how much.
Well, we don't know her name. We don't know.
No, that's true. We don't. Let's see. We recovered about $150,000 in wages, plus my attorney's fees.
Did she get her passport back?
She got her passport back. She actually has now has a green card.
Oh, wow.
and is a legal resident of the United States.
Excellent.
We actually were able to work with her and with the folks who helped her to normalize her immigration status.
Oh, good job. So now
Yeah,
tell me, on that or other kinds of cases you cover, how would that affect or inform you as an attorney general? What would you do with the experience you've had in those cases?
well, I think the thing that I've learned through doing this work specifically for the last decade, and I think this is something every time I have the opportunity to talk publicly about this to an audience, I find that people are really kind of astonished by it as well, and it has certainly astonished me. Was the extent of the shadow economy in Connecticut. Now, here in New Haven, I actually have a colleague who joked, but unfortunately, it's quite true that that here in New Haven, the minimum wage for dishwashers is $8 an hour. Of course, the Connecticut minimum wage is 10 and a quarter. But what he meant by that was simply that by consensus, this is what local restaurateurs will pay for a dishwasher because they can, because they assume that these folks are powerless, because these are going to be often either immigrants, often people who are undocumented. They're taking these jobs because they're the only jobs they can get, and they will end up being paid less than the minimum wage because it's accepted in the shadow economy that that's enough.
Wow. And what would you do as Attorney General about the shadow economy? Is that more of a Labor Department issue, or how would you?
Well, in New York, and I guess I should mention this just to sort of give at least some credit where it's due. That William Tong, one of the Democratic contenders for Attorney General, has said that he would like to see the Attorney General's office establish a civil rights division, and I think he's
and
right.
A unit with immigration within that.
I'm sorry.
He also wanted an immigration unit within that.
That's right. And I think he's right. That's a step in the right direction, and he's right to point to Massachusetts as one place where they have done that. On the other hand, I would look at the state of New York. The state of New York's Attorney General's office has several divisions that deal with a number of different kinds of significant problems. They also have a labor division that has collected millions of dollars in unpaid wages.
Don't we have that with the Labor Department? They handle those cases.
They do handle those cases. They don't handle anywhere near the number of cases that there are out there, and they definitely do not have the visibility or the resources presently to be able to address more than a tiny fraction of the cases.
All right, Peter Goselin, candidate for Attorney General for in Connecticut. Let's look at some of your other positions. You've talked about wage theft, workplace discrimination, abortion. You said you'd like to get court orders for safety zones around clinics, so women can access services without fear, and bringing civil rights charges against these domestic terrorists who target women and LGBTQ people in the name of fake family values. Now, why isn't the AG doing that? Aren't our Democratic attorneys general pretty completely pro-choice?
I think that any state department, any state agency is going to establish priorities. And as I mentioned, the Attorney General in the state of Connecticut historically has focused on consumer rights issues, large-scale multi-state class actions, but there are other things that perhaps should be more pressing, should come to the top of the agenda. And I think at this particular point in time, in this particular point in our history, it's important for the government to take a really clear stand to make it clear that people's rights aren't just things that are written on paper or written about in legal decisions, that there's something that the government itself takes seriously and will enforce. And I don't see that happening in Connecticut.
Kamara Cooper checks in on Facebook. Good morning, Kamara. Thanks for checking in. I hope I've pronounced your first name right today. She writes to you, Peter, what is the plan to bring well-known companies to Connecticut, and what will you do to ensure they stay long-term? Do you see that as an attorney general function? Because actually Sue Hatfield was in here, a Republican, who said the attorney general's been keeping companies out of Connecticut because we don't have a business and friendly environment because we sue companies, which I guess of course Supreme Court is people, for financial fraud and taking advantage of consumers.
Well, I think that if companies want to work in an environment where there is a highly trained, highly educated workforce who are and they're not afraid of people knowing what their rights at work are, of course they should be operating in Connecticut. But the criticism that we're not creating a sufficiently business-friendly environment really amounts to a criticism that we're not letting them get away with enough. You know, it's not as if we have 100% enforcement, for example, of sexual harassment laws. I'm sure that there are numerous folks within the hearing of this radio station who have experienced sexual harassment on the job and have said, you know what, there's just nothing I can do about it. I can't prove it. I'm afraid to do anything about it, or I lost my job, or I quit a job because of it. We don't have full enforcement of our laws that prohibit sexual harassment. We don't have full enforcement by any means of the laws that prohibit, wage theft. These are enormous problems. The agencies that are supposed to be dealing with them don't have the resources. So every time I hear that buzzword about business-friendly environment, what I hear is, well, so you want us to actually reduce our expectations even further. When people go to work, they should expect even less from their employer. They should expect that they're going to be kicked around and treated badly. And that's just ridiculous.
Kamara Cooper, thank you for that question. I'm sorry I got another mistake here. I was looking at the wrong part of the picture. Kamara Cooper is male, and thank you very much for that question. And Peter Goselin is in the studio here talking about his run for Attorney General as a Green. On your website, Peter, which I guess is newly up, you have a hate speech provision. Hate speech is not free speech. The right of oppressed groups to live free from fear should be protected from alt-right threats and violence. The spread of neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups calling themselves the alt-right isn't just Donald Trump's fault. They are aided by spineless politicians and by sympathizers and law enforcement who pretend that cross-brownings and brown-shirted parades are just another form of free speech. This is from Peter's website. I support Antifa activists who use direct actions to challenge hate speech, and I believe the Attorney General should act against groups that use speech to incite violence and terrorize others. So is it fair to say you're taking sides in defining hate speech? Because some people say Antifa does believe in breaking laws to confront, to commit violence or disobey parameters of how demonstrations are set up to let people talk. And could want to argue from that position, you're not taking the traditional ACLU position that protects the Nazis to march in Skokie, even though they abhor what they have to say?
So you're asking me, am I taking sides against Nazis?
No.
Yes, I'm taking sides against Nazis.
I'm not asking if you're taking sides against Nazis. I'm asking whether you're protecting free speech for people you agree with rather than ones you don't.
I think the notion that there's this thing called free speech that's absolute and pure is...
Well, it's not. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? You're not free to do that.
The rule supposedly is that the law prohibits only things like time, place, and manner, and not content. Experience shows that not to be true. When you look at the way that police departments police left-wing demonstrations versus right-wing demonstrations.
Right, they're harder on left-wing, no question.
Yeah.
But that's because police departments often, or military organizations, have a right-wing bias.
Exactly. So there isn't such a thing as a bias-free approach to the question of free speech. There are positions that we have to take in order to preserve free and open discussion. And yeah, that means that there are things that are beyond the pale. I know this is an example. I know that this is an area where those of us on the left and folks like you as journalists might very well clash about. But I think it's a discussion that's really worth having because, and I also think it has some really important.
And even the ACLU now is divided on it. The younger members do not believe that there's an equivalency.
I think there's there's also an aspect of this, as with many of the things that we're talking about. There also is an aspect of this that also touches on the issues of things like race and gender and religion, because it's one thing for us to say, gee, you know what? It doesn't bother me if the Ku Klux Klan marches through my town because that I don't feel personally threatened by that.
Or I feel threatened. It bothers me, but it's important to me that their rights are protected so that mine are as well.
Right, and the question is, are we doing enough to listen to the people who are mostly directly impacted by fascists? Are we listening to Jews, Muslims? Are we listening to people of color? Are we listening to LGBTQ people? Are we listening to women? who are saying, no, I feel personally threatened by this. This isn't just speech. This is intended to keep me out of the public forum.
Calls to action. I guess that was the argument for hate crime laws after the Wyoming Matthew Shepard case, where LGBTQ people felt they weren't safe,
Yes, exactly.
So if it's being incited to commit violence, that was the argument.
Yeah, and I think that, it's easy to say that we know what inciting violence looks like from the safety of you and me, our skin color, our race, our gender, how we present in the community. But it's an entirely different matter for the folks who experience that. And I think one of the reasons to have this discussion about hate crimes and about taking a stand against taking a stronger stand against fascist speech is that we haven't been listening to those voices. They have not been part of the dialogue.
All right. And Peter Goselin, we've lost the Facebook feed apparently, so I don't know if other people are weighing in here, but let me go to a couple more of your positions here. You said that the attorney make Connecticut a part of the global boycott, sanctions, divestment (BDS) campaign in defense of the people of Palestine. What specifically would the AG do? Would it just be a public figure lending a voice, or are there actions you would take as an AG?
Well, certainly within the parameters of what the Attorney General can do. This is really something that would involve initiating a discussion. The Attorney General doesn't have the power to make the state divest, economically, for example, or to take sanctions. But it does have it is among other things, it is a bully pulpit. And I think it's worth talking about the relations that the United States has with Israel at this point in time, when there has been such really global condemnation, especially around the recent the demonstrations in Gaza and the response by the Israeli Defense Forces, something that really went far beyond anything that is acceptable under the rules of international law.
All right. And then I'm really interested in this next position. The Attorney General's office, this is Peter's website, should weigh in on the personhood of non-human animals, including apes, elephants, and whales. The Non-Human Rights Project has taken legal action in Connecticut on behalf of elephants kept in prison in a private zoo. I always feel weird even about dogs like being kept in a backyard, but that's another. No, seriously. But anyway, providing convincing legal arguments that certain mammals that are similar in the cognitive abilities to humans should be treated as persons under the law. Peter writes, the Attorney General's office should weigh in as an amicus curiae in support of those animals who are more similar to us and encourage the courts to recognize their personhood and order them freed from captivity. So would you get rid of zoos? Would you use the AG to get rid of zoos?
Well, let's talk about the scope of this particular issue, because it is actually a live legal issue in Connecticut right now. The Non-Human Rights Project has taken the position that because of the similarity between certain groups of animals and human beings, in terms of things like cognitive ability and brain structure and the ability to communicate with each other in complex ways, the ability to use tools, things like that, that these are classes of animals that deserve some higher level of respect than they are currently accorded under the law. Under the law right now, all animals, to the extent that they are not wild animals, are simply property. And what we're talking about, what the Non-Human Rights Project has talked about, is the idea that they be conferred a kind of a limited kind of legal personhood, not given all the rights that human beings have, but at least the right of autonomy, which is the right not to be held in captivity.
So why are you drawing a line between some animals and others? How do you draw that?
Well, I think there are two things. First of all, I would not necessarily say, oh, that's the end of the story. But I would say that the thinking behind this approach has been based on the idea that there is scientific evidence to support the similarities between these species and us as human beings, and that when we start to think about the idea that these similarities are so profound, it starts to call into question the idea that we can simply relegate them to the category of property. That there has to be some reckoning that they have some greater status than that.
So would you have zoos at all?
I'm sorry?
Would you have zoos at all?
Ultimately, I think that we might not have zoos at all. I think that we might very well be headed in that direction.
And would the AG be involved in this? Would you actually press lawsuits against Beardley Zoo or something like that?
Well, in terms of what we're talking about right now, there is there's a legal action that's presently pending in the state of Connecticut. The Non-Human Rights Project has brought, and my position is the Attorney General should support that and take the position that that this is a new development in the law that we would welcome because we recognize that we have a responsibility to the people to the beings that we share the planet with. Not just human beings.
I've been wrestling, and people are going to think this is totally out in outer space. I've really been wondering a lot lately when I walk to work why we have private ownership of dogs. I see them just caged up all day, and then they're loving slaves or whatever, And I love dogs, but I've never owned one. But my wife, who's a vegetarian, says we've bred these dogs to be domestic. They're not for being out in the wild, and there's sort of this mutual benefit between the owner and the animal. I have a hard time with that. Do you have a feeling? Are you AG Peter Goselin going to take a stand on private ownership of dogs?
I'm not ready to take that stand yet. I think there's some interesting discussions about the idea of domestication and what that means. I think your wife's got a good point. But I am ready to say that when it comes to elephants, whales, apes, that these are beings that we clearly can communicate with. And we know from our communications with them that they are like us in some rather significant ways.
Can we communicate with dogs?
I'm sorry?
We can communicate with
dogs.
Oh,
of course we can communicate with dogs. But the evidence that dogs, for example, just to pick on dogs for a minute, but the evidence that they have the ability to engage in the kind of cognitive reasoning that, for example, an ape can, or an elephant even, that the scientific evidence doesn't seem to support that.
I know I'm really pushing way beyond where the discussion ever is going to go in real life, but why is cognitive reasoning? Now, obviously, just because there's no bright line about where you draw the line between what's a sentient being and not, doesn't mean the discussion is not valuable. For instance, I know people who say thankful prayers before they eat plants, and I just think that's crazy. Except it's nice that you're part of a larger ecosystem spiritually that it's grown for our benefit. But it's hard to draw that line. Like, why are we deciding what the terms are that make an animal deserve freedom?
Certainly, and there are some issues that I think even those of us who are not vegetarians and haven't figured out where we're going to draw that line yet. There are things that trouble us when we see the use of animals in medical testing, for example. Like, we want to know that that's actually necessary.
I will admit that I eat honey. I just couldn't give up honey, so I'm a vegan rather than a vegan. And people say, well, the bees are doing that honey for our benefit. Well, I say, well, that's kind of what they do naturally. And they say, well, is it an animal product if it's bee vomit? When it comes out. So these are the kind of crazy conversations we have that might not determine the fate of the Attorney General's race. Do you eat meat?
I do.
Okay, why?
Because
so you'll eat them, but you won't put them in a zoo.
Well, again, different groups of different groups of animals with different abilities. Would I condone animal testing on chimpanzees? No, absolutely not. Because because regardless of the question of the benefit that might generate for human beings. We are essentially torturing a brother species, I suppose you could say, right. who are very similar to us in so many ways.
Why do you eat meat? Just out of curiosity.
Why do I eat meat? Mostly because I've never been able to convince myself not to. Mm-hmm. I actually, as a matter of fact, this is a discussion in our family because my wife and I have both gone for long periods of time as vegetarians. And then a number of years ago, we decided to have a Thanksgiving turkey, and it was all downhill from there.
The tryptophan just got you.
That's it, exactly.
Truth is, I believe you should never judge other people on what they eat, because compared to how people are treating other people right now in the world, that's not the big fight.
It's interesting how people can draw standards about what is acceptable conduct. That we can walk by a homeless person sleeping on the sidewalk but feel very indignant about the fact that other people eat meat.
Someone I think you might know, Timothy Goselin Jr. writes in, stranger things have happened. If corporations are people, then why not ... I like this. Your brother?
My nephew, actually.
Nephew, I think you're onto something there. Thanks for...
yeah, no, it's a really good point. It is something that actually the Non-Human Rights Project, when they've talked about this issue of personhood, have pointed out that in addition to the fact that corporations are persons under U.S. law, that in various places in the world, decisions have been made at various times that have conferred personhood on, among other things, in India and in New Zealand on rivers.
Oh, wow. Rivers are people?
Persons, not people. Persons that have a certain set of rights under the law, which are not identical to all the rights that we have, but it places a kind of a limit around what can be done. Because after all, the problem we have is that because we've created this dichotomy of personhood and non-personhood, everything that's not a person presently, everything to which we do not attribute that status, anyone can own or do anything they wish to within the scope of the law. So
it's important that you can't own a river.
So yeah, in this case, this was I think the case in New Zealand involved a river that had tremendous significance, cultural and spiritual significance to the folks who lived in that area, and they wanted to ensure that in perpetuity that there would be no way that it could be encroached upon or misused. And so they came up with the idea of seeking personhood for it. And ultimately the New Zealand court agreed. And there's been a number of decisions like that in various places over the years.
Before we go, Timothy, and we're back on Facebook, thankfully. Thank you, Harry Droz, our station manager. I want to ask you quickly a question I've asked all the AG candidates from 2 other parties as well. When you give advice, that's a different role as Attorney General. The governor of the legislature says, can we do this legally? And the candidates are coming and giving different views of this. One, Mike D'Agostino, who did drop out, said, I find the result I want, then I find a basis in law to get there. And Claire Kindle says, sometimes when I'm in that role, I'm going to have to sometimes rule against the party I want to see prevail. And this all came up in the fall of 2017 when the legislature approved a new concessions package with unions that the Republicans didn't like, and they wanted to overturn part. The Democrats said the legislature couldn't legally do that. Jepsen, who's a Democrat, the Attorney General, ruled that overall he supported the Democrats, but he felt he had to be honest and say there was a legal basis for the Republican argument, just so the lawmakers could have all the legal information they had at hand before making a decision. Who's right, D'Agostino or Jepsen?
I'm not going to tell you who's right. I'm going to tell you that it's important that we thoroughly examine not only what we think the law says, but why we think it says that. That sometimes going to the issues of our motivations for wanting a particular result and the way that they cloud the way that we look at the law. I know that when I'm in the position of giving legal advice to an organization, and I have had some experience with that, particularly with labor unions, but also with some other organizations. When I'm in that role, I'm going to be really trying to understand the other side as best I can.
So if you have to give a decision about a law you don't agree with, Democrats have gone passed a law that you feel is, let's say, insufficiently pro-labor. Are you willing to give the opinion that says the law does not support a pro-labor action by the government?
I am willing to give the opinion that that law does not go as far as I think it should, and I'm also willing to include in that the ways that that law could be interpreted or the way it could be modified in order to get to the place we want. So you can still intellectually
honest to give a roadmap for how to have the result you'd like, but would you also say here are some of the obstacles? The way you would
absolutely.
In private? Yeah.
No, I think that we have to be frank about some of the obstacles. I think that, frankly, as a labor and employment lawyer, one thing I can tell you, I feel like I've had considerable success in the work that I've done. But for working people, bringing legal claims under this system of law, it's nothing but obstacles.
And are you going to take public-private financing, by the way? You're going to qualify for that?
I'm not gonna qualify for it because I'm not likely to raise enough money.
Oh, so you can't get somebody's company. You can say, hey, I really won't. You could tell Pfizer or someone, I'm really not gonna.
Well, after they hear this show, they'll be lining up.
But then you can go to the door and say, hey, I really won't sue you. What do you think? Go to some of the cop unions, say, like, I'll stay out of Guilford if you give me some of your.
There you go.
You're not going to do that, are you?
No, I don't think I can do that.
All right. And any last-minute predictions about the Robert Mueller investigation?
I predict that that we're in for the long haul. That this is something this is really a battle between two elements of the ruling class in the United States. The only thing I can predict about it is that the outcome is not going to benefit working people in Connecticut one way or the other.
But if Peter Goselin is elected from the Green Party to become our next Attorney General, it sounds like you are promising that what you do will benefit working people in Connecticut.
I sure hope so.
All right. Well, Peter Goselin, it was a real pleasure to meet you today.
Same here.
Like we never met before, but our lives had some similar paths on it. And just let people know they can go to Goselin 4 number 4.
Goselin number 4 AG dot org.
Or just go to Google and say Peter Goselin, Attorney General. Probably get there too.
You'll find out all kinds of things about me.
All right, well, thanks a lot, and good luck on the campaign trail.
Thanks.
And thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks for the comments, Kumar and others. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free, from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. Now, we know what it's like to be free. We just got to remember to book our flight. Fly free with us all day and all night long here at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.